What's up, my shit fits? This is your host, Rafael Matuszewski, and this is Cut the Shit Get Fit. I am currently filming this to do part 2 of the morning routine controlled articular rotation thing that I started last time. So for all my listeners, I highly recommend you click the show notes, click the link to YouTube, my YouTube channel, which you should subscribe because I've been posting a lot on there. I have a lot of exercises. I've surpassed the 1,000 video mark of like exercise demonstrations, tutorials on exercises, the video podcast, and some other stuff. So highly recommend you check that out. So we're gonna, 1, do a small review, what we did last time. 2, we're gonna move on to all the other body parts that we didn't hit. So we need to hit our elbows, our wrists, our hips, our knees, our ankles, and if we have time, the toes, because I'm gonna get into that later. Anyway, shout outs before I forget. Number 1, super excited about this. Cleveland, Ohio. Shout out to everyone in Cleveland listening to my show. Fun fact, favorite artist is Machine Gun Kelly. That's where he's from. Shout out to everyone in Cleveland. Number 2, all the way here in Canada, the city of Calgary. Shout out to everyone in Calgary. And number 3, I think it's been on my top 5 the past couple weeks. Chicago, Illinois. Shout out to everyone in Chicago. Super awesome. Getting people from all other places. Really, really, really cool. All right, so CARS. What the fuck are CARS? Controlled articular rotations. That's the long name. Essentially what it means is the entire range of motion your joint is designed to move in. If we don't use it, we lose it. Facts. So to keep a joint healthy, you have to move the articulation through its entirety. If I only use my shoulder for my phone, my laptop, and grabbing a cup out of the cupboard, and I don't move my shoulder in any other plane of motion, then all those other parts of the joint itself is going to get tight. It's just not going to be healthy, The more we move our joints, the better the joint itself is going to be, because we're surrounding it, lathering, if you can think about it, literally lathering the entire joint with synovial fluid, nutrients, everything it needs to be a strong, resilient, robust joint for us to move and do all these different things. Quick side note before I forget. Walt Disney's birthday was yesterday. Shout out to all my Disney fans out there like I am. So CARS is essentially moving our joints through our own workspace, where the more we can challenge our workspace, the more healthier our joints are going to be, but also kind of reinforce through our nervous system that we own that range of motion. So I'm doing a shoulder car with my arm, and the more I do it, the more I will have full control of that motion of my entire glenohumeral joint, but also reinforcing to the nervous system that, hey, I own this movement, don't take it away from me. Because our nervous system is one of those things that it's like, hey, you haven't squatted past 90 degrees in a year because you sit at a desk all the time. I'm going to take that ability away from you because it's super energy sucking. Like our nervous system is smart, but sometimes it just fucks us over long term. So that's why we always got to move. So we're going to move on to our elbows. So last time we did our neck. Last time also we did our scapulas, our shoulders, and our T-spine. Now if you've been practicing those, awesome. If you haven't, start. I'm going to do a separate video showcasing a full maybe like tutorial on how to do the CARS routine, which I'm going to need for my book anyway, which by the way, I'm hoping 2021 around summer should be released. Keep an eye out. So elbows. So the elbow is one of those joints. I always call it, it's a non-sexy joint because it doesn't do much if you really think about it. Other than, flexion, so I'm doing a bicep curl, extension, and like rotation, right? That's basically it. But if you combine it with your shoulder, flexion, extension, rotation, and now think about how different all these different directions our shoulder can go into, our elbow can go into all those directions as well, right? So it's an interesting way to combine two joints together, right? But elbow pain is huge, and funny enough, I am dealing with elbow pain myself right now because you know what? I did something stupid. And this is a great example because people, when they see my ability to move, they just assume that, oh, you never have any pain. Oh, you're never injured. I fucking get injured. So went to the grocery store, and it was one of those trips where I'm like, oh, we're just going to grab like 2 things, and by the time we got out of there, it's like I have like 12 fucking bags with me, and here I am with a hurt elbow. So, but I did not injure myself carrying all those bags. It was later on. So here's a scenario. I have about 7 grocery bags in my right arm, and my left arm I'm holding the biggest bag of flour because it's almost Christmas time and I need to be prepped with a lot of flour so I don't run out. So bag of flour on my left side, right side, 7 bags. But I did not have my elbow locked out to full extension to hold it like a farmer carry. And funny enough, this is where like specific training comes into play. When I do farmer carries, I have my elbows in full extension and gripping tight, like 70 pounds, 80 pounds, whatever it is. Never had an issue. But when I was holding these grocery bags, I had a slight bend in my elbow, so slight flexion while gripping, because like if I had it straight out, it'd just be hitting my leg the entire time when I was walking, so I had to make some room. And I think in that position, I was actually loading my brachioradialis tendon, because right now, even when I'm pushing on it, it does not feel good. It's there. So I kind of like preloaded it, and like it was like just holding on by a thread at that point. And then later that night, cleaning up, and I had to put away a chair in our storage. I grabbed the chair with both hands and I extend both of my elbows to place it in the storage room. And the moment I went into full extension, the sharp shooting pain right into that tendon. That's the moment when I injured myself. That's the moment, and I've wrote about this in my book. To define an injury, the best way to describe it is when an external force comes within our tissue and the tissue yields. Meaning, force comes in, tissue's like, holy fuck, I'm not used to that kind of force, so now I'm broken, now I've torn, now I have inflammation, whatever it is. And this is where Kinstretch comes into play. If I can preload a tissue in different variable motions and movements, so now my body can adapt to that input and can adapt to that stress and that load, so when I go out in the real world and pick up weird shit like that, then I'm more prepared. So now in my head, I'm like, man, I have not really worked my elbows in my Kinstretch. And elbows is one of those things that people end up hurting periodically, and it's one of those injuries that's so annoying because then that's when you realize, like, fuck, I use my elbow for a lot of things. So that being said, I'm going to now incorporate a lot more elbow work. And when what my previous comment said, like, think of the shoulder car, how many different positions that arm can go into, and now adding an elbow car to it. Like if I'm back here in my kind of like abduction and what's that called? Extension of my shoulder, now I can start adding my like elbow cars and just crank that out and maybe hold a tennis ball, lacrosse ball, whatever, to create, you know, some irradiation, some tension, some stability, some safety, right? But long story short, let's showcase how to utilize elbow cars. So I am standing. Hopefully the camera can see everything I'm doing. So my hands are going to be out in an anatomical position. I want people to think of going into a bicep curl with both arms up. And my hands are in that karate chop position like we did with the shoulder car. Now that I'm at my end range of flexion, I'm going to rotate, meaning I'm going to do a pronation movement with my forearms, so now you can see the palm of my hands. From this position, I'm going to go down, kind of like a reverse bicep curl going down. So now my forearms are facing you. From here, I'm going to come back into flexion. I'm going to go back into rotation, so I'm going to go into supination, and then I'm going to come back down. So essentially, we're just doing flexion and extension with pronation and supination. And here's the key though, I'm not just like flopping my forearms going back and forth. When we start, and say I'm back to our anatomical position, when I do that flexion like curl thing, my thumbs, so if you can see in the video, my thumbs, I'm driving them forward as far as possible, like hard, like end range hard, right? So look at the difference. So this is like if I just did a normal curl, it's not going anywhere. But now if I really focus and try to drive, look at that extra little bit. And my forearms right now are on fire. And funny enough, like I can feel my brachioradialis tendon, like it's like, hey, I'm there, right? So I'm constantly driving those thumbs. And then as I rotate, I don't know why I moved back, to pronation, same idea. Like I don't just stop here, I'm like, oh, that's it. I'm driving my thumbs forward as far as possible to get more. And I always say that in my kin stretch class, get more. A lot of people kind of go into their end range and they're like, oh, yeah, I'm just gonna hang out. But I'm like, fucking get more. You can go get more. And I'm almost like thinking like if you took a towel and it's wet and you're trying to wring out that towel, like you're not just gonna like squeeze a little bit, because you know there's a lot of water in there, so you're gonna crank that thing as hard as possible to get all the water out. Same idea with elbow cars. That's what I want to see. So nice little demo, anatomical position, curl, rotate, down, back up, rotate, back down, and that would be one. The key thing here with elbows, people will get things like tennis elbow and golfer's elbow. The way to remember it, and I think I got this when I went and got my TPI certification. The way to remember it is, for most guys, they have, you know, hair on their forearm. And tennis elbow is always on the outside of their elbow, because that's where a majority of all their hair is, and a tennis ball has that kind of fuzzy covering on it. Whereas on the inside of your elbow, even with a guy that's super hairy, the inside of the elbow tends to be like hairless. Like there's literally like no hair on the inside of the elbow. So golfer's elbow, because the golf ball is kind of smooth to touch, right? So tennis elbow, fuzzy side, golfer's elbow, smooth side, right? Super easy to remember. So those two tend to flare up a lot on people. And the funny thing is that a lot of people go treat that area right off the bat. But most of the time, when it comes to injury, it's usually looking at the joint above, aka the shoulder, or the joint below the wrist. And we'll get to the wrist in a second, but people with limited shoulder mobility will tend to do stuff overhead, and I'm reaching overhead right now. Now imagine as I bring my arms up and I limit shoulder flexion, we talked about this before. I'm gonna arch my back to get more, And usually what happens is people will bend their elbows to kind of simulate more shoulder flexion. So now I have this like constant bend in my elbow while doing things overhead. And a lot of times people will press overhead without a locked elbow because they know if they bend it, they can get a little further back. People trying to do chin-ups. This is where I see a lot of injuries to elbows, is when people don't have full range of motion at their shoulder joint, they will end up placing a lot of stress, usually on the medial side of the elbow, so they'll get golfer's elbow. Just because the shoulder doesn't move like a shoulder should, so now the elbow's taking up all the strain, right? That being said, when it comes to the elbow as well, the wrist, a lot of people have terrible wrist mobility, and wrists, I always say, are often forgotten when it comes to training, movement, and just like human anatomy. So think about what you use in the gym probably the most. It's your wrists. So every time I grip, every time I do push-ups, every time I do mountain climbers, every time I do stupid burpees, every time I do anything like bench press, dumbbell rows, whatever it is, my wrists have to be mobile in order to do those things. But most of the time, people don't have enough wrist extension in order to do those things. So what happens? If this wrist can't extend, where do you think most of the pressure is going to now transfer to? It's going to be the elbow, and that's usually, you will see like tennis elbow stuff when people don't have enough wrist mobility. So a lot of times when I teach wrist cars in my Kinstretch class, nobody has an absolute clue or kinesthetic awareness to realize how to dissociate their wrist from their elbow. They end up utilizing movements of their wrist with their elbow and can't separate the two. And that goes to show that when they're in the gym or what they do in everyday life, again, the elbow's taking the grunt work, right? So if we just focused on, hey, I'm gonna make my shoulder move better, and I'm also gonna make my wrist move better, so then I don't get elbow pain. In my case, I have good wrist mobility and shoulder mobility. What I did wrong that created that issue was I exceeded the load, that load capacity essentially, that my tendon in my forearm that it could take, right? And this is another great example of how everyone's body's different, right? Like, you can think like, oh, I hurt my thing between my shoulder blades because I did this, but in reality it could just be like stress levels and your overall volume of training and everything else going on in life, or you physically like popped a rib out because you did some fucking snatch overhead and couldn't stabilize it, right? It's so individual, and that's why we need a thorough assessment, a thorough warm-up, a thorough approach to everything. And this is why I think a lot of people kind of hit a plateau or kind of a wall in their training when they don't have something specific. In the very beginning, they'll see some sort of progress, but down the line, things tend to fall apart. So, that was a lot of talking. Let's showcase wrist cars. So the way I coach it, if I was standing, my elbows are going to be glued to my rib cage. My fingers are going to be glued together, and again, karate chop position. What we're going to do in this position, both hands, like my fingers are going to reach down to the ground as far as possible. I'm going to come into the middle and then open up towards the ceiling, out to the right, and back down. And again, I'm going to get a different view. Up, out to the side, and down. And kind of similar to my elbow cars, I'm going as far out into my outer ranges so I don't end up just like, oh, I'm just doing small circles. I'm like at my end range, right? And my forearms are feeling it, like I'm working. And now I'm gonna go in the other direction, same thing. So one thing where everyone gets this wrong is I tell people, your forearms are always pointing up towards the ceiling. Imagine your cell phone on your forearm, a glass of wine, whatever is really important to you that fits on your forearm, don't let it fall. And what happens is when people try to do this, because they don't have full control of their wrist or some sort of mobility limitation, they end up utilizing their forearms like I was saying before. So a lot of times what happens is they go down, they go in, and like, oop, the elbows come off the rib cage because they don't have the range to go into this little movement here, and they need their elbows to help, and they end up doing this weird like rotation thing with their arms, and I'm like, no, you guys, like, squeeze those elbows together, don't let your forearm, and then people end up doing this thing, and it's like some weird dance wizarding spell thing, and I'm like, no, you need the forearms not to rotate. That wrist needs to move freely in relation to that forearm, right? So if you look at my forearm, barely moving, it's just my wrist. Like, it literally looks like my forearm is kind of like dead while my wrist is moving. A lot of people have trouble with that. Wrists. People will get wrist pain because they don't have full mobility. People will get wrist pain in bench pressing because, again, they don't have full extension, and now you're fucking loading it with a barbell with fucking 225, 135, whatever it is, right? So those wrists need to have full mobility to do stuff. The other thing too that you'll see, and I had this before in my left hand, I remember for the longest time when I would, you know, kind of go too quick on my warm up, and I'm like, okay, I need to do push-ups, and I go into my push-up position. Sometimes I would have like sharp pain from the bottom of my wrist to like my last two fingers here, kind of like really fast, and then something I would almost like strain the inside of my hand. And it wasn't until I took the FRC almost 3 years ago now, and when I checked my wrist extension, my left hand was significantly a lot less. And I remember, I'm like, oh shit, like that happens to me when I do push-ups. When I do bench press, that happens to me. I always get wrist pain, and it's because I didn't have enough extension on my left side, and I'm like, I need to work on this, right? Sorry, my watch is just going off. So with wrists, always forgotten, make sure you have good control, good mobility for everything we do. We're gonna move on to the hips, so I'm gonna have to like back up. So similar to the shoulder, the hips influence a lot of movement. If people have limited hip internal rotation and external rotation, or any movement plane that the hip can go in, shit will fuck their entire life, if you really think about it. Not from an exercise standpoint. It will influence every fucking thing you do. So when I work with an individual and they have pain in their low back, guess what I'm looking for? Do you have hip internal rotation? Do you have hip external rotation? And can you control those two? Most of the time, it's no. So it's like, easy. Give you more hip mobility, boom, low back pain is gone. In science, right? Like crazy, groundbreaking. Who would have thought? You make a joint move really, really well and pain goes away, right? So in all seriousness, if someone has limited hip mobility, it's going to cause a lot of issues and pain will follow. So hip CARs is one of the things that I give to almost every single person. And just like the shoulder, there are ways to modify it if someone has pain, and ways to, you know, deviate away from painful patterns and things like that. So again, think hip like your shoulder, moves in so many different planes of motion, and we gotta find what works for you. But for the sake of this video, we are going to showcase a regular hip CAR, what to look for, what to train, and here we go. So I'm gonna move back a little bit. Hopefully you can see me. In a standing position, it's always good to have, you know, hand on the wall, hand on your bench, whatever it is. The outside leg is going to be the working leg. What we're going to do is drive our knee into as much flexion as possible and like as high as possible. From here, you're going to go as wide as possible into abduction. From here, you're going to rotate that hip into internal rotation. This is literally the hardest thing to do. And from here, I'm going to try to go to extension, around and behind, until my right knee meets my left knee. Now I'm halfway. Now I'm going to go back into extension, external rotation, open up to abduction, and then come into where I started. And sorry for the phone shaking, because I have this plopped onto my bed, and my dog is sleeping, and she tends to twitch when she's dreaming. So that was the hip car. If you noticed, my entire body, other than my hip, did not move. When people have restrictions, this is what you're going to see. One, they come up not as high as I did. Like, this is my full flexion. Or if they try to imitate me, they have to bend that bottom knee, and that's all they get. From here, when people come out, they won't go all the way out like I did. And when I ask them for internal rotation, they bend over to get internal rotation. So what you're going to have to do is go a little bit lower and go turn into internal rotation. And usually this motion, going to internal rotation and kind of kicking around, is where people lose all sense of direction, all sense of space and time. They have no idea what the fuck their hip is doing. And it's super awkward, super weird. And the person looks at me like, did I do it? Like, what it is. So practice until it's like we groove the pattern. In the hip car, a lot of times, and this is another variation that I like to use, is like you can have both hands on the wall to kind of get a little bit more feedback as you go through the motion, right? And again, with the, say if I'm using my right hip, my left elbow, I want to make sure the left elbow stays locked out the entire time. Just like the shoulder, a lot of people have hip pain. A lot of people get pinching, things like that. So when I have some really broken people, what we tend to do is break it up in half or in two parts. So a lot of times when I work with people that are in pain, have a lot of stuff going on, we just do this. We go into our flexion, we go into our abduction to external rotation, and then we close the door and back. And we literally just take that first little bit of the hip car just to move through it. As we progress, because I know that this transition of internal rotation is really, really, really difficult, then I will now kind of work the back piece. So it's like, okay, we got this going on. So now what we're going to do is the last bit where I'm going to stand, kick back, and try to open up into external rotation and back. And I just eliminated this small little section of the transition. And then I can always work that transition in a supine position, just doing axial rotations, which is another thing that I could talk about forever, but we're already like close to 30 minutes on this thing and we haven't hit the knee, ankle, or toes. So we're gonna move on. I'm gonna take you guys for a little ride onto the floor with me, and hopefully it is bright enough for you guys to see me. Yeah, this is good. Actually, yeah, it's good. Okay. Knee cars. The knee has the ability to go into external rotation, internal rotation, extension, and flexion. Very similar to the elbow if you think about it. The issue here is, just like the wrists, when I get people to do knee cars in my kin stretch classes, people have no idea how to fuck to move their knee joint, and they end up doing this weird ankle thing. So how to do knee cars is, we're gonna have right knee bent, left leg straight out, right hand goes through the right leg, and then my left hand's gonna hold my right hand kind of like this, like I'm doing a solid handshake. And then I'm gonna pull my hip into flexion. So I'm gonna lock out my hip to prevent any influence from the hip to cheat. From here, because we're just working the knee joint, we've eliminated our hip, we also gotta eliminate our ankle. How do we do that? We throw our ankle into dorsiflexion. So I'm pointing my toes up towards my face. I tell people all the time, whatever you do in knee cars, never have your toes into plantar flexion. Never point them forward. Always have them pointing up towards your face the whole time. To start, I tell people, use your toes as a steering wheel. Turn that steering wheel to the right. And exactly at that moment, I'm turning my tibia, which is the bone in my shin, into external rotation. From there, I'm going to extend my leg up as high as possible. So now I'm in extension. Now I'm going to turn that steering wheel of my toes in to the left, and now I'm in internal rotation, and I'm going to come back down into flexion. And then you repeat. You come right back to where you found it, out to the side, and back down. Now, when people do this, what I tend to see is they're good at externally rotating it, but then the moment I ask them for extension, they kind of like let go of the ankle, they start pointing, and they just start using their ankle for this while moving their knee into flexion extension. But that's not it. You want to lock out that ankle, so then you just have tibial rotation, both internal and external. When I see people limited in external and internal rotation of their tibia, and like literally in this video, pointing my toes up towards the ceiling and my heel is dug into the ground. If you look at where my fingers are pointing towards the camera, if I take my tibia to the right into external rotation, you see where my fingers are pointing at, and you can see where my toes are. And now if I turn it in to internal rotation, you can see where my fingers are. So now this should move freely. Like, look how much range I have. For the most part, people either don't know how to freely move their tibia, especially when it comes to, any kind of running, squatting, lunging, whatever it is. If they're limited into internal and external rotation, the distribution of force through the leg is going to be kind of all just stuck in this knee, and then people will get things like shin splints, ankle pain, knee pain, hip pain, low back pain. Having adequate tibial rotation allows you to disperse the force throughout the body evenly, so then you don't get any kind of pain. The biggest thing that influences our tibial rotation is every time we walk, every time we run, every time we sprint, every time we lunge, deadlift, squat. It's pretty important. Just like the wrists, knees are often forgotten. When I see a difference between left and right, now I know that every time that person squats, lunges, or whatever, they have a favorite side that has more range of motion, or the same side because that hip has more range of motion. And then we get all these weird asymmetries and pain and crap like that, and it all stems from the knees. Now, we're gonna move to the ankles. How that's gonna look. Same kind of position. Right knee bent, right hand through. This time, I'm gonna lift my hip up first. Left hand is gonna go on my right shin, right hand on my left forearm. So I'm in a Kimura lock. So if you follow the UFC or any kind of jiu-jitsu, you know what a Kimura lock is. From here, I'm trying to move my ankle just like my wrist. I am drawing those big circles, right? Really simple. I'm using my toes to lead the movement back and forth. And then you switch directions. So the issue that I see a lot is when people go and do the ankle car, they're really good at, this position, plantar flexion and dorsiflexion, but the moment they deviate out to the side and inside, they almost get this like chunky, like almost spasmic kind of feeling, and then at the top they're like, oh, good, and it's like, and it's all good, and then it's like almost jagged, you know? And all that tells me is that they have zero control when it comes to inversion and eversion of the ankle. And that also tells me that when it comes to a situation where, say you're taking a step off a sidewalk, and because you're so good at dorsiflexion, plantar flexion back and forth to walk, any kind of, you know, variable where maybe your ankle goes into inversion, no control, and boom, now you have a rolled ankle, right? So being able to be efficient on both inversion and eversion of the ankle and having full control of that, most likely when you're presented with any kind of variable, you know, surface when you're walking, you'll be able to recover, right? But I see a lot of times people just don't have full control. Last thing, we're gonna do our toes. So when it comes to, actually going back to the ankles, when I see a limitation of ankle mobility, obviously things like squatting, lunging, any leg exercise, any walking, running, or whatever it is similar to the knee, it's going to have a huge influence. When our ankles are limited in range of motion, it's going to affect us a lot. So pay attention to those small joints like the ankles, the knees, the wrists, everything. They play a huge, huge role. And they kind of support bigger joints that have more influence, like our hips and shoulders. So we're going to move on to the toes. So the reason why I place a huge emphasis on the toes is that toes are probably the most forgotten joint, because they are joints out of everything in our body. The kicker here is that when it comes to toe mobility, everyone's terrible at it because we put socks on our feet and we wear shoes all freaking day. Our feet are exactly like our hands. If you look at the anatomy of our feet and hands, very similar, to a point where they almost have the same amount of bones. I believe the hands going up to the wrist is a total of 27 bones, whereas our feet and up to the ankle, there are 26. So very, very, very similar in design. But the huge difference is that our feet don't get the proprioception or the variance of feeling like our hands do, because they're always exposed. So what happens is our feet go into something called atrophy, where we end up losing the strength of all the muscles, all the small intricate muscles responsible for our feet. So then people end up with flat feet, collapsed arches, bunions, like all this kind of weird shit that prevents us from doing what we do best, as being human. So really simple, I'll show you 4 variations that I do in my Kinstretch class. I tell everyone, all right, when I tell you to lift, it's just going to be your big toe. So all the rest of the digits stay down onto the ground, and then you just lift the big toe. And then back down. You lift, and back down, lift, and back down. You would be surprised how many people can't do this. This simple little, like, just lift your big toe and place it back down. If this big toe does not move the way it's designed, for sure is going to cause a lot of problems. If you think of any kind of propulsion or a way for your body to produce power, it comes from your big toe. That's your first point of contact onto the ground. But when people don't have full mobility or control of that, they're losing a lot on the table, and who knows what their feet do when they're asked to run, right? The other variation I tell people to do is the big toe stays down while the rest go up and then back down, up, back down, up, back down. Then from there, all toes come up, big toe only, and back up. Big toe only, back up. From there, big toe stays up while the rest go down and up. Down and up, down and up. ideally, eventually what you should be able to do is one toe at a time coming up and down, right? Lots of practice for this guy. So to kind of wrap things up, because we're getting pretty close here. Toes, often forgotten. When I do this in my kin stretch classes, you see all these people like looking down their toes and they're like, it's just not working, or people will like start squeezing their hands, or like they'll start pointing at their toes like they're like trying to command them to lift and come back down. And imagine if those people, or even yourself who's watching, listening, whatever it is, get really good at this, how much that was going to change if you decide to go for a run, if you decide to do step-ups in the gym or push that sled. Like, having full control of those toes are going to make a difference, a huge difference. And it's also going to go up the chain, because now maybe your knees and ankles don't move that well, but now that you're moving your toes better, the ankles and knees don't have to take that much of the responsibility for whatever you're asking your body to do. So that's going to wrap it up for this episode, because I've talked for 41 minutes and I could keep going, but we now have the entire morning routine from the neck down to the toes. If you did 3 repetitions of every single joint, it would take you less than 10 minutes. And this is kind of like the bare minimum I tell people to do, is like, if you could do this every single day, 10 minutes, like literally that's all you needed to do, your body will thank you. Your body will move better. It's going to groove better, and you're going to have less pain because you're constantly inputting to your nervous system that these joints have to move. Now, as the joints move, you're improving its integrity by adding synovial fluid, lathering it with nutrients. This is why movement is medicine. The more you can move, the better you're going to feel. Like, that's it. That's it. That's it for today. If you guys have any questions, feel free to reach out. Hit the show notes, add me on Facebook and Instagram. If you want to watch this episode, if you're listening, hit the show notes, and the link is going to be in there. A lot of great stuff that we went over. Like, I still think this episode was great for just listening, because I spoke on a lot of personal experiences, what I see in my classes and things like that. One of these days I need to do like a Facebook or Instagram live of a kin stretch class on the weekend that you guys can follow along, but down the road. Anyway, thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. Hit the show notes. Like I said before, give me a 5-star review. Subscribe to my YouTube channel if you haven't. That's it for me. Till next time, you guys.